the Great Plains, home of the American bison and dozens of Native American nations. This vast geographic expanse left space for the diverse plains cultures to develop, resulting in many different customs and languages from one end of the Great Plains cultural area to the other. The Plains Indians were mostly nomadic, following roaming herds of their main food source, the bison. Skilled riders of the horse and users of the bow, the Plains Indians moved around the vast grassland quickly, hunting bison with ease. Entire communities moved with the herds, employing the use of teepees. This nomadic lifestyle culminated with the wonderfully diverse cultures and languages of the open plains, resulting in the emergence of the Plains Indian Sign Language. In this way, it became the silent voice of the plains. The Plains Indian Sign Language is an interesting linguistic phenomenon. It was the lingua franca of the Great Plains, but unlike other lingua francas, it wasn't spoken. It was signed. It is difficult to trace the Plains Indian Sign Language to a singular origin, but it may have arisen from a need to communicate with deaf members of the community, or it may primarily serve the purpose during hunting, where talking would have scared the prey. As it spread, many deaf and non-deaf members would have picked it up. Its usage would not be relegated to only communication where sound could not be used, however, for it would have accompanied their native language in everyday discourse. Because of its nature as an alternate language independent of any singular Plains nation, it can be argued that the sign language could be picked up and used by other nations without fear of any single language dominating the Great Plains. And so, this language became useful for many reasons among Plains Indian nations, and permeated into all aspects of Plains culture, used during hunting, communication, trade, rituals, and storytelling. Plains Indian Sign Language was used among many different nations that spoke unrelated languages. The sign language was usually learned as an additional language to be used alongside their native language. Some of the earliest records we have of the language are the journals of Lewis and Clark. During the expedition, Sacagawea and another interpreter, George Julliard, were observed using the sign language to communicate with various peoples encountered. The language has also had its usage documented and observed among many different Great Plains nations from the fieldwork of multiple anthropologists and linguists. One of the first people to extensively study the language was ethnologist Garrick Mallory. His early research of Native American spoken and sign languages was a great contribution to the Smithsonian, although he found trouble in trying to document visual hand signs into writing. Another early researcher of the language was Lieutenant William Philo Clark, who was taught the sign language by Native American scouts employed by the Army. He later compiled a comprehensive guide of all the signs that he had learned. Unfortunately, this unique form of communication is nearing extinction, with little use even among deaf Native Americans. Once in time, there were hundreds of thousands of signers across the continent. Now, there are a few dozen at most. In the 19th century, the United States set its sight on conquest of the Great Plains, ending up in violent conflict and war with many of the Native Americans and users of Plains Indian Sign Language. The settlers sought to forcefully assimilate and confine the Native Americans, sending children and youth to boarding schools, such as the Carlisle Indian School. These schools were used to wipe away their cultural heritage. They were forbidden from using their native languages and were forced to use English. These schools indoctrinated Native American children into mainstream white American culture, preventing indigenous culture from being passed down. Today, the endangered language is spoken by at most a few dozen, with varying proficiency. Plains Indian Sign Language has been passed down generations mainly by tribal elders who preserve the traditional language. Its usage has been seen in native deaf communities as a form of communication, although this is very rare. Alongside the decline of indigenous languages as a whole, Plains Indian Sign Language has also become increasingly displaced by other languages. Its practical use among deaf communities has largely been displaced by American Sign Language, and as a lingua franca, it has been replaced by English for intertribal communication. Knowledge of the language is quickly disappearing, with most of the fluent signers sadly being elders that are passing away. This problem is happening with many indigenous cultures, especially accelerated due to the COVID pandemic. Native languages have increasing morbidity due to the effects of globalization and gradual assimilation. If Plains Indian Sign Language someday loses all of its signers, a facet of Plains culture and historical knowledge will be lost forever. In the past century, Plains Indian Sign Language and other indigenous sign languages have been studied by numerous linguists and anthropologists looking to document these dying languages. Along with these efforts, a few natives have launched revitalization efforts to increase the number of heritage signers. During the conflicts in the Great Plains, General Hugh L. Scott, in his first commission, explored the plains and learned about many Native American languages, including the Plains Indian Sign Language, which he signed fluently.
Young men are not learning your sign language, and soon it will disappear from this country. It is for us to make a record of it for those who come after us, before it becomes lost forever.
General Scott spearheaded the preservation of Plains Indian Sign Language, commissioning Congress and the Smithsonian to produce a film documenting the sign language. He brought together representatives from 12 different Plains Indian nations, resulting in the largest intertribal meeting ever filmed, forming the 1930 Indian Sign Language Council. This film helped to pioneer linguistic history. General Scott was one of the first people to use film to document a language, a solution to Garrick Mallory's problems in documenting visual signs and writing. On the site of the film, the Museum of the Plains Indian was founded, which preserves the cultures of the Northern Plains tribes today. Over 80 years later, Dr. Jeffrey Davis, professor of sign language and linguistics at the University of Tennessee, brought together skilled signers and hundreds of people from over 20 nations and tribes at the American Indian Sign Language Conference.
Question, but 80 years later, we went back there and filmed everybody, but all of the people that were in the of course, were dead. They were old at the time, but we were amazed about 400 or 500 people came. There was a lot of people that came.
This was the first time Native American signers have come together since the original 1930 council, and Professor Davis's work is an important step in the preservation of Plains Indian Sign Language. One of the main instructors of the language today is the Apsaloke educator, Dr. Lanny Real Bird. He has developed resources and taught Plains Indian Sign Language among many different communities. He is an indigenous language instructor and works to preserve other languages as well. As a fluent signer, he is instrumental in the revitalization of this language. Most recently, in 2019, the Poundmaker Cree Nation hosted a language camp for Plains Indian Sign Language. They invited Dr. Lanny Real Bird to teach and immerse their students. This camp attracted dozens of interested students, eager to learn their heritage. Despite these efforts, Plains Indian Sign Language remains dormant today. The majority of its signers are heritage signers, and can use a different indigenous language, English or ASL. Because of this, it is critical to understand the cultural and historical importance of the language. The sign language exists as an art form that can be used in both traditional and contemporary storytelling. Its main value today is seen in this storytelling, which allows the user to express art in a unique style.
And so I was just interested in it as one of my as part of my cultural legacy.
It is a method of communication that unites the culture of many different nations, and thus is a claimable piece of heritage for many Native Americans that have lost parts of their culture. Although aspects of Cree culture may be vastly different from the Ojibwe or the Pawnee, these nations can all appreciate the shared aspect of their cultures through the art that this language can create. The beautiful part is that with gradual documentation and research of the language, it becomes more accessible for people to learn it and translate it, so that even non-fluent signers can make art. All this is to say that the language is truly dormant. But in the long term, the hope is that there can be more learners and a revitalization of the usage of the sign language. Unfortunately, over centuries of conflict and forced assimilation, Plains Indian Sign Language is nearing extinction. Today, there are at most a few dozen signers, a number that is quickly declining. Without proper documentation and preservation, we risk losing a precious cultural treasure. However, there is hope. No longer forced to renounce their culture, the younger generation have revived and embraced many of their people's customs. Just like other native language revitalization programs across the country, Plains Indian Sign Language is seeing a comeback through the dedicated efforts of tribes and individuals.
These languages aren't dead, they're just sleeping. So we have to go around and wake them up. We're going to go around and knock on the doors and, hey, you still remember anything? You remember it? Do you remember it?